Meghan has huge ambition. She is a very resilient, attractive woman to look at, and because of the mystery.
Renowned royal investigator Tom Bower just leaked what he claims are the hidden financial terms inside Meghan Markle's divorce playbook, and Prince Harry was completely unprepared for the fallout. This isn't just a rumor. It's a highly calculated strategy that insiders say could derail Harry's entire future. While the palace tries to downplay the crisis, the true implications are far more serious than anyone is letting on. What exactly did Bower just expose? Let's look at the evidence. Tom Bower and why his words carry weight. Not every person who writes about the royal family deserves to be taken seriously. That is simply the reality of an industry that attracts speculators, gossips, and opportunists in roughly equal measure alongside the genuine investigators. Royal commentary is a crowded space. Claims are made daily. Sources are cited anonymously. Revelations are packaged and sold with varying degrees of actual substance behind them. Tom Bower is not that kind of writer. And that distinction matters enormously when you are trying to understand why what he has just exposed about Meghan Markle's divorce terms has sent genuine shockwaves through the people closest to this story. Bower has spent the better part of 4 decades building a reputation as one of Britain's most rigorous and most feared investigative biographers. His subjects have included Robert Maxwell, Richard Branson, Tony Blair, and Gordon Brown. These are not vanity projects or celebrity profiles. They are forensic examinations of powerful people conducted with the kind of methodical sourcing and documentary discipline that has made Bower's work genuinely consequential. Several of his books have triggered legal challenges, parliamentary discussions, and in at least 2 cases, formal investigations into the conduct of the people he wrote about. He does not publish things he cannot substantiate. That is not a courtesy he extends to his subjects. It is a professional standard he has maintained, because his entire reputation rests on it. When Tom Bower says he has evidence of something, the people who know his track record take that statement seriously. Not because they like him, not because they agree with his conclusions, but because he has earned that credibility through decades of work that has repeatedly proven itself to be accurate under scrutiny. His 2022 biography of Meghan Markle, titled Revenge, was the book that first established him as the definitive investigative voice on the Sussex story. It drew on over 300 sources. It contained specific, documented claims about Meghan's conduct before and during her time as a working royal that were detailed enough and sourced well enough to survive the intense legal and media scrutiny that followed its publication. Meghan's legal team examined it closely. The book remained standing. So when Bower began speaking in early 2026 about what he described as the hidden terms inside Meghan's divorce settlement with Harry, the people paying closest attention were not the tabloid readers looking for the next headline. They were the lawyers, the palace advisors, and the senior media figures who understand that when Bower speaks with this level of specificity, he has done the work. The question everyone immediately asked was why now? Why was Bower surfacing this information in early 2026 rather than earlier? The answer to that question is itself revealing, because it connects directly to a shift in the broader Sussex situation that has been developing quietly over the preceding months. By early 2026, the Sussex marriage had moved from a subject of public speculation to something considerably more concrete. Multiple sources across the American and British media landscape had been reporting with increasing confidence that the relationship between Harry and Meghan had reached a point of serious and potentially irreversible strain. The couple had been spending significant periods apart. Their joint public appearances had become noticeably infrequent, and the unified communications operation that had characterized the Sussex brand since their departure from royal duties had developed visible fractures, with sources close to each of them separately, briefing journalists in ways that did not always tell the same story. Bower had been watching this development with the attention of someone who had spent years studying both individuals closely, and he had been sitting on specific information about the terms that Meghan had quietly put in place around any future separation. Information that had been provided to him through sources he describes as having direct knowledge of the legal frameworks governing the Sussex partnership. He chose to surface that information in February 2026 through a series of media appearances that were carefully sequenced. Not a single explosive revelation dropped into the press in one moment. but a measured, progressive disclosure that allowed each element of what he had uncovered to be properly absorbed and assessed before the next piece was added. That sequencing was deliberate. It is how Bauer operates when he is most confident in his material. He does not sensationalize. He does not reach for the most dramatic possible framing. He lays out what he knows, in the order that makes its significance most legible, and he allows the weight of the information to do the work. The first element he disclosed was the existence of what he described as a pre-negotiated separation framework. Not a prenuptial agreement in the conventional sense. Something more specific and more unusual than that. A set of privately negotiated terms that Meghan had insisted upon and that governed not just the financial dimensions of any future separation, but the communications rights, the narrative control, and the public positioning of both parties in the event that the marriage ended. That disclosure alone was significant enough to generate immediate and serious attention. But it was what Bauer revealed about the specific contents of that framework that stunned the people who had been following this story most closely. Because the terms, as Bauer described them, were not simply protective. They were strategic in a way that revealed a level of forward planning that Harry, by all accounts, had not fully understood when he agreed to them. And the implications of that forward planning for his ability to speak freely, to reconnect with his family, and to chart his own independent future were more constraining than almost anyone outside the immediate legal circle had realized. What exactly were those terms? What had Meghan put in place? And why was Harry, a man who had already given up his royal title, his country, and his family relationships in pursuit of the life Meghan wanted, left stunned by what emerged? That is precisely where we are going next, and the details are more significant than the headlines have yet captured. The hidden terms and what they actually mean. To understand what Tom Bauer exposed, you have to first understand the context in which these terms were created, because the framework Meghan put in place did not emerge overnight. It did not arrive as a panicked response to a deteriorating marriage. It was constructed carefully, quietly, and with a level of legal sophistication that speaks to a very deliberate long-term strategy. Bauer's sources describe a process that began as early as 2022, a period when the Sussex marriage was still presenting a unified public face, but when, behind that carefully maintained surface, certain private arrangements were already being put in place. Arrangements that were framed at the time as protective measures. Sensible precautions taken by a woman who had already experienced the devastating consequences of being publicly exposed and institutionally unprotected. That framing was not entirely without merit. Meghan had genuinely experienced a level of public scrutiny and institutional hostility during her time as a working royal that would have prompted most people to think carefully about their legal protections going forward. But what Bauer's sources describe goes considerably beyond reasonable self-protection. What they describe is a framework that was constructed not primarily to protect Meghan in the event of a separation, but to control the terms of that separation so comprehensively that Harry's ability to independently shape his own narrative, his own relationships, and his own future would be fundamentally constrained. The first and most significant element of what Bauer exposed involves communications rights. Specifically, the question of who controls the Sussex story in the event of a separation, and under what conditions either party can speak publicly about the marriage, the relationship, or the circumstances of its ending. According to Bauer's sources, the framework contains clauses that are extraordinary in their reach. Harry agreed, in signing the relevant documents, to a set of restrictions on his ability to speak publicly about the marriage that go significantly beyond the standard confidentiality provisions that govern most high-profile separations. He agreed not to give interviews, write memoirs, or participate in documentary projects that address the marriage or its breakdown without Meghan's explicit prior approval. He agreed that any public statement he made about the relationship would be subject to review by a legal representative acting on Meghan's behalf before it could be released. Read those terms carefully, because what they mean in practice is that Harry, who has already demonstrated through the publication of Spare and the Netflix documentary that he is willing and able to speak publicly about his most private experiences, would find that ability severely curtailed in the specific area that matters most to his own story. He could speak about his childhood. He could speak about his military service. He could speak about his relationship with the royal family. But the Sussex marriage itself, the central chapter of his adult life, the experience that defined everything that came after it, that would be subject to Meghan's approval before he could address it publicly. The second element Bauer exposed involves financial architecture, and this is where the forward planning becomes most visible and most consequential. The Sussex brand, the commercial operation that has generated income through Netflix deals, Spotify partnerships, speaking engagements, and the various ventures operating under the Arkewell umbrella, was structured in a way that Bauer's sources describe as designed to ensure that in any separation scenario, the controlling interest in the most valuable elements of that brand remained with Meghan. The specific mechanisms through which this was achieved are legally complex, but the practical effect, as Bauer explains it, is relatively straightforward. Harry's name and royal identity contributed enormously to the commercial value of the Sussex brand. His HRH status, even in its diminished post-resignation form, his military background, his position as the son of a king, these things had genuine and significant market value that underpinned the deals Meghan was able to negotiate. But the legal structures governing those deals were arranged in a way that decoupled Harry's ongoing participation from the revenue streams his identity had helped to create. In plain terms, Bauer's sources suggest that Harry helped build something whose financial benefits he would not fully share in if the marriage ended, and that the terms he had agreed to meant he had very limited legal recourse to challenge that arrangement. The third element is perhaps the most personally damaging for Harry. It involves the children, Archie and Lilibet, and what Bauer's sources describe in this area is the detail that, by all accounts, hit Harry hardest when the full picture of what he had agreed to began to become clear to him. The framework, as Bauer describes it, contains provisions around the children's primary residence, their public profile, and their future participation in any royal or British institutional life that give Meghan a level of unilateral decision-making authority that would be very difficult for Harry to challenge through the American legal system. The children were born in the United States and are American citizens. Their lives are centered in California, and the legal jurisdiction governing any custody arrangements strongly favors the parent who is the primary caregiver in the location where the children are established. Meghan understood this. Her legal team understood this. And the framework was constructed in a way that formalized and entrenched that advantage in terms that Harry had agreed to before the full implications of those terms were visible to him in the way they became visible when the marriage began showing serious strain. Bauer is careful in how he presents this element of the story. He does not suggest that Meghan is an unfit mother or that her desire for primary custody of her children is anything other than understandable. What he suggests is that the legal framework was constructed with a sophistication and a forward-thinking strategic intent that Harry did not match when he agreed to its terms. That there was an asymmetry in the legal preparation on each side that has left Harry in a significantly weaker position than he understood himself to be in when he signed. The question that Bauer's disclosure immediately raises is how Harry responded when the full scope of what he had agreed to became clear. And the answer to that question requires understanding something important about where Harry was emotionally and psychologically in the period when these terms were being negotiated. By 2022, Harry was a man who had already made the most consequential decisions of his life. He had left his country. He had walked away from his royal role. He had written a book that burned bridges with his family in ways that could not easily be unbuilt. He was living in a foreign country, dependent on a commercial operation whose success was directly tied to his continued partnership with Meghan. He was not, sources close to him confirm, in a position of psychological strength or legal independence when the framework Bauer describes was being put in place. He was, in the assessment of people who know him well, a man who trusted completely, who believed that the partnership he had chosen was built on a foundation of genuine mutual commitment, and who did not bring to the negotiation of its legal terms the kind of independent scrutiny that the situation, in retrospect, clearly required. That trust, and what it cost him, is at the heart of everything Bauer has exposed, and the palace's response to what has emerged tells its own very significant story. Because William, Charles, and the senior advisors inside Buckingham Palace have been briefed on the details of what Bauer has disclosed. And what they know, and what they are choosing not to say publicly, reveals something important about how the institution is positioning itself for what comes next. That is exactly where we are going in the next chapter. Harry's position, and the palace's quiet response. There is a particular kind of shock that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with raised voices or visible distress or the kind of dramatic emotional display that makes its way into press reports and palace gossip. It arrives quietly. It settles into a person slowly. And it changes the way they see everything that came before it in ways that take time to fully process. That is the kind of shock that sources close to Harry describe when they talk about his response to what Tom Bower has exposed. Not the shock of someone hearing information for the first time. Harry knew, in general terms, what he had agreed to. He had signed the documents. He had been present for at least some of the legal discussions that produced them. But there is a significant difference between agreeing to something in the abstract, in a period of life when the possibility of its application feels distant and theoretical, and confronting that same thing in the concrete, when the marriage it governs is visibly under strain and the terms you agreed to are no longer theoretical at all. Sources close to Harry describe a man who spent considerable time in late 2025 and early 2026 going back through what he had agreed to and seeing it, perhaps for the first time, with the clarity that comes when circumstances force you to read something not as a committed partner, but as an individual whose interests may no longer be identical to those of the person sitting across the table. What he found when he looked at it that way was not reassuring. The communications restrictions alone represented a significant problem. Harry had built his post-royal identity around the ability to speak. Spare had been the most visible expression of that identity. The Netflix documentary had been another. His ability to tell his own story, in his own words, on his own terms, had become not just a commercial asset but a psychological lifeline. The act of speaking publicly about his experiences had given him a sense of agency and control in a period of his life when almost everything else felt like it was being decided by forces outside his influence. The realization that the framework he had agreed to placed that lifeline under Meghan's legal oversight in the specific area that mattered most to him personally was, sources confirm, genuinely destabilizing. Not because he believed Meghan would necessarily exercise that control vindictively, but because the existence of that control, the fact that it had been put in place at all, told him something about the nature of the partnership he had entered that he found deeply uncomfortable to sit with. He sought legal advice independently. That detail is confirmed by two separate sources familiar with his situation. In the autumn of 2025, Harry retained a legal advisor operating entirely separately from the Sussex joint legal operation that had governed most of their shared affairs since leaving royal duties. He wanted an independent assessment of where he stood, what his options were, what the realistic consequences of various possible futures looked like from a purely legal standpoint. The assessment he received was not encouraging. The framework Bower describes was, in the view of the independent legal advisor Harry consulted, robustly constructed. It had been put together by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had anticipated the specific challenges that Harry might subsequently want to mount against it. The communications restrictions were enforceable. The financial architecture was largely settled, and the custody provisions, given the children's established life in California and the jurisdiction that governed their situation, would be very difficult to challenge successfully through the American legal system. Harry sat with that assessment for several weeks before Bower's disclosures brought the situation into the public domain. And during those weeks, sources describe a man wrestling with a set of questions that had no easy answers. Questions about what he wanted his life to look like, about what kind of relationship with his children was possible under various future scenarios, about whether the path back to any kind of meaningful connection with his family in Britain was still open to him and what it would require to walk it. Those questions brought him, inevitably, back to the palace. Not in a formal or public way, not through any channel that generated press coverage or official acknowledgement, but through the quiet, careful, back-channel communications that have characterized Harry's sporadic attempts to maintain some thread of connection with the institution he left. The palace's response to those communications is where the story becomes most significant and most revealing. William had been briefed on the broad outlines of Bower's forthcoming disclosures before they became public. His response, according to sources familiar with his thinking, was characteristically measured. He did not express satisfaction at Harry's predicament. He did not brief against Meghan or use the situation to score institutional points. What he did was ask a single, practical question, a question that cut through all of the emotional complexity of the Sussex situation and landed on the thing that actually mattered from an institutional standpoint. He asked whether Harry's current legal position gave him the freedom to make independent decisions about his relationship with the royal family, or whether those decisions were, effectively, subject to the same framework that governed everything else in Harry's life. The answer to that question, as it was relayed back to William's office, was that the situation was complicated, that Harry retained theoretical freedom to make his own choices about his family relationships, but that the practical and financial consequences of exercising that freedom in ways that conflicted with Meghan's interests were significant enough to represent a genuine constraint on his ability to act independently. William absorbed that information. He did not immediately act on it. He did not reach out to Harry directly or signal through intermediaries that a rapprochement was suddenly possible. But he did something that sources describe as quietly significant. He instructed his office to ensure that the channels through which Harry had been making his back-channel approaches remained open, that no door was formally closed, and that any communication from Harry was received and considered rather than dismissed. That instruction represented a subtle but real shift in William's posture toward his brother. Not a reconciliation, not an invitation, but an acknowledgement that the situation Harry found himself in was more complex than the public narrative suggested, and that the institution's response to that complexity should reflect its own long-term interests rather than its short-term frustrations. Charles, whose health continued to be a source of significant concern inside the palace throughout this period, was also briefed on Bower's disclosures. His response was quieter and more personal than William's. Sources describe a father who found the details of what Harry had agreed to genuinely painful to contemplate, not because of any political calculation about what it meant for the monarchy, but because of what it revealed about the circumstances in which his younger son had been living and the degree to which Harry had been navigating them without the kind of independent support that might have produced different outcomes. He did not say this publicly. He has not issued any statement. He has maintained the same careful silence on Sussex matters that the palace has sustained through years of provocation and pain. But those close to him describe a man whose private feelings about what Bower has revealed are considerably more complex and considerably more compassionate than the institution's official silence might suggest. The palace knows what Bower has exposed. It understands the implications, and it is watching carefully to see what Harry does next with the information he now has about his own position. Because what Harry does next will determine whether the door that William has quietly left open leads anywhere, or whether it remains a door that was always open in theory and never walked through in practice. The answer to that question depends on factors that extend well beyond the palace walls. It depends on Meghan. It depends on the legal framework that now governs Harry's choices. And it depends on what both of them decide to do with a situation that Bower's disclosures have made considerably more difficult to manage in private. What that means for the bigger picture is the final piece of this story. And it is the piece that has the most significant long-term consequences for everyone involved. What this changes for everyone involved. When a story of this magnitude enters the public domain, the immediate focus almost always falls on the most dramatic elements, the specific revelations, the named individuals, the details that generate the most immediate emotional response. But the most consequential aspects of what Tom Bower has exposed are not the details themselves. They are the shifts those details produce in the broader landscape that everyone connected to this story has to navigate going forward. And those shifts are significant. For Meghan, for Harry, for the palace, and for the public narrative that has governed how this family's story has been told and understood for the better part of a decade. Start with Meghan, because her position, in the aftermath of Bower's disclosures, is more complicated than it might initially appear. The framework she put in place was, from a purely strategic standpoint, a sophisticated piece of legal planning. It protected her commercial interests. It secured her narrative control. It established legal provisions around her children that reflected the reality of their lives in California. From the perspective of someone who had experienced genuine vulnerability inside a powerful institution and had resolved never to be in that position again, the logic of what she did is not difficult to understand. But the public revelation of that logic is a different matter entirely, because the image Meghan has spent years constructing is not the image of a strategic legal operator protecting her commercial interests. It is the image of a woman who acted from the heart, who made decisions based on love and principle and a genuine desire to build something authentic outside the suffocating constraints of royal life. The gap between that image and what Bauer's sources describe is significant, and it is a gap that Meghan's communications team is going to find very difficult to close. The specific detail that has generated the most damaging public response is the communications restriction, the provision that gives Meghan legal oversight of Harry's ability to speak publicly about the marriage, because that detail cuts directly against the central narrative of the Sussex departure, the narrative that said they left to find freedom, to escape control, to live and speak on their own terms without institutional interference in their ability to tell their own story. If the terms Bauer describes are accurate, and his track record provides very little basis for dismissing them, then what Harry exchanged when he left the palace was not control by one institution for freedom. It was control by one institution for control by another. He traded the palace's management of his public life for a private legal framework that managed it just as comprehensively in the specific area that mattered most to him personally. That is not the story Harry told in Spare. It is not the story the Netflix documentary presented. And the distance between the story that was told and the reality that Bauer is now describing represents a credibility problem for the Sussex narrative that no amount of careful communications management can easily resolve. Meghan's team has maintained silence on the specifics of Bauer's disclosures. That silence is, as noted previously, a choice rather than an absence of response. But the longer that silence is maintained, the more it functions as a kind of implicit acknowledgement that the framework Bauer describes exists in some form. A direct and detailed denial would be the obvious response to a false account of legal arrangements. The absence of that denial is itself informative. For Harry, what changes most fundamentally is his public position inside the story of his own life. He has spent the years since leaving royal duties constructing a narrative of agency, of choices made deliberately and defended openly, of a man who knew what he was walking away from and made peace with that knowledge because what he was walking toward was worth the cost. Bauer's disclosures complicate that narrative in ways that are genuinely difficult to absorb. Because if the framework is, as Bauer describes, then some of the most significant choices in Harry's post-royal life were not made from a position of full information or full legal independence. They were made by a man who trusted his partner's judgment, who did not bring independent scrutiny to the legal arrangements governing their shared life, and who is now discovering what that trust cost him at a moment when the marriage those arrangements govern is under its most serious strain. That is not a comfortable story to be the subject of, and the question of how Harry responds to it publicly, whether he contests Bauer's account, whether he stays silent, or whether he finds some other way to address what has emerged, is one that will define his public position for a considerable time to come. The palace is watching that question with considerable attention. William's decision to keep the back channels open, as described in the previous chapter, reflects a calculation that Harry's current situation may have created a genuine opening for some form of reconnection that previous circumstances had kept closed. But that calculation is contingent on Harry having both the desire and the practical ability to walk through the door that has been left open. The practical ability question is where the legal framework Bauer describes becomes most relevant to the palace's thinking. If Harry's communications and his public positioning are as constrained as Bauer's sources suggest, then any move toward the royal family that Harry might want to make would need to be navigated within those constraints. Any public statement of reconciliation, any attendance at a royal event, any visible shift in his relationship with William or Charles would be subject to the same legal scrutiny that governs everything else in his life under the framework Meghan put in place. That is an extraordinarily complex situation for a man who has already demonstrated that complexity and careful navigation are not his strongest suits. Harry is, at his core, a person who operates from instinct and emotion, rather than from strategic calculation. The situation he now finds himself in demands the opposite of that. It demands patience, legal sophistication, and the ability to make long-term decisions in the face of short-term emotional pressure. And the people who know him best are not entirely confident that he has those tools available to him in sufficient quantity. Princess Anne, whose assessment of Sussex matters has historically been the most unsentimental inside the royal family, reportedly described the situation with the kind of directness that has always characterized her perspective on Harry's choices. She said that Harry had made his decisions, and that the consequences of those decisions were now visible. That sympathy was appropriate, but that sympathy without accountability served nobody. and that the door back to any meaningful relationship with the institution remained open only to the degree that Harry was willing and able to walk through it independently. That last word, independently, carries more weight in the current context than it would in almost any other. Because the question of whether Harry can act independently, given the framework Bauer has described, is no longer a theoretical one. It is the central practical question governing his future. And it is a question that only Harry, his lawyers, and the woman who put that framework in place fully understand the answer to. What Bauer has done, through the careful and methodical disclosure of what his sources have told him, is bring that question into the open. He has made it impossible to ignore. He has placed it at the center of the Sussex story in a way that will shape how that story develops for months and possibly years to come. And he has done it, characteristically, without sensationalism, without personal animosity, and without reaching beyond what his sources and his evidence can support. That is why his words carry the weight they carry. That is why the palace is paying attention. That is why Harry's team has gone quiet. And that is why this story, far from being resolved by its emergence into the public domain, is only now entering its most consequential chapter. Tom Bauer did not write a headline. He laid out a documented account of legal arrangements that have changed how this story is understood. Harry built a life around the freedom to speak. What Bauer has exposed suggests that freedom was always more conditional than anyone knew. The full consequences are still unfolding.